This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to tip number 7 about setting up your company in China. And today we're going to be talking about what is registered capital. This always stumps people. I think the biggest concern that people have is how much capital do I actually have to invest? Is the government going to stop me from doing business if I don't have enough capital, etc. So I think we got to start from the beginning, right? When you are going into the Chinese market, it is absolutely critical that you create a budget, right? There are two things I always ask clients. One is, what are your financial resources and what are your time resources in terms of entering the Chinese market? And looking at the financial resources, you have to understand how much capital do you need to go into the Chinese market and how much capital do you actually have. So creating a budget is fundamental when starting your pre-investment stage going into the Chinese market. When you set up a company in China, you will have to designate what is called a registered capital amount. And this is ultimately the working capital amount you need to start up your business in China. Initially, it's going to be utilized to pay off for all of your expenses, whether it's office rent, salaries, purchase of goods, paying third-party providers, etc. The list goes on, okay? In order to know that number, the easiest is obviously to create this budget. Now, a few years ago, or historically, basically, it was a requirement that you had to have a certain registered capital amount. And so people, instead of creating budgets to know exactly what they needed, they would just go by this guideline of this minimum requirement that was set forth by the government. I think this is absolutely wrong, and it frustrates me when people don't do their budget. I beg people year on year to do their budgets to understand how much cash they actually need. The concept of the registered capital, again, is about how much capital do you need to start up your business in order or until you have a positive cash flow status. So it's money that you're actually going to be utilizing as your working capital. With the new foreign investment law, you don't have to actually insert a total investment amount. I've still inserted that in today's tip because with the incorporations I've done in 2020, it is still a requirement to add that in. And ultimately, there's a ratio between the registered capital and the total investment. So if you need help on the total investment aspect, let me know and I can help you calculate that ratio amount and what it should be. Some people will say that the registered capital should be the same as the total investment. I disagree because I think emergency funds are always needed when you're starting up in a new market. And the idea is that the registered capital is what goes into the account. The difference between the registered capital and the total investment is called your foreign debt loan, and that can be considered as your emergency funds. A lot of people are also concerned by the timeline of when this capital has to enter the account. Now, when you set up your company in China, you are designated or you have to indicate a term of validity. How long do you want your company to be established for? There is a minimum of 10 years. And I believe there's a maximum of 50 years. There's no right or wrong in terms of the timeline that you want to choose. A lot of foreign investors feel more comfortable choosing the 10-year mark. I don't know why. I think it's a psychological component to it. But basically, you have that length of time of that term of validity to insert that registered capital. But by the end of that term of validity, the total registered capital should have been injected. Okay. Now, there's a lot of things going on with this registered capital because you also have to open up a capital account with the bank in order to receive that registered capital from the shareholder. Capital goes in and you can start utilizing it to pay off your expenses. Again, you know, there has to be a balance on how much you need and how much you actually physically can put in, okay? Another thing you have to think about is the liability aspect, because a limited liability company in China is liable up to its registered capital value. So again, you don't want it to be too high, but you also don't want it to be too low because you need those funds to pay off for your expenses. Registered capital is a very tricky subject. Happy to run it through you. The best would be if you've created your budget so you already have a figure in your head of how much money you need, and then we can talk about what is the right balance and what amount would be needed. Reach out to me and I'd be happy to brainstorm with you. Take care and goodbye.